Episode 6. In the last episode, we looked at some of the events that surrounded Napoleon. Now in the 6th episode, we will look at the Battle of Borodino, 1812. 1812 would see the Battle of Borodino, a part of the French conflict with Russia. It ended in victory for the French and would see massive territorial losses for Russia. But the battle would also be characterized by massive casualties. It would see several important and notable figures, the likes of Mikhail Kutuzov, Barclay de Tolly, Michel Ney, and several others. Numerous troops had been involved in the fighting, and prior to the Battle of Borodino, the invasion of Russia had been underway for months. The Russian army had been using their own strategy in order to slow down the French advance, and the French forces would lose several troops to the conditions at hand and the shortages that existed. The Battle of Smolensk would occur during this general period. One of the changes that came after the battle was the replacement of Barclay de Tolly with Kutuzov, a general who would continue to gain compliments and play a large role in the fight against the French. In the general period as well, preparations would be made by Kutuzov's army. Prior to the battle as well, the Russian army would undergo many changes, some of them in response to the losses they had endured, like the Battle of Austerlitz. Another event that had occurred had been the Battle of Marengo, a battle that ended with French victory and had involved several individuals and seen fierce fighting. It would see the involvement of the French Republic, on whose side were individuals the likes of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Desaix, and Jean Lannes, as well as the Habsburg monarchy, on whose side was Michael Melas. At the end of the fighting there would be negotiations, which would see the involvement of Melas and would see the Austrians withdraw from some of the regions they were in. Events at the Battle of Eylau would involve conflicts between forces under Bennigsen and the French troops. It would be a fierce battle that would be hampered in some way by the weather. It would see massive casualties on either side. Present during the battle would be several significant individuals who would continue to play varied roles in the way the events unfolded on the day, in a battle that would involve formations, strategies, and conflicts in a complex web of events that would see the lives of several and numerous individuals influenced. Whether they were there on the battlefield, actively participating in the conflict, or they were home taking part in the war. The fate of many would depend on some of the actions that would occur at the Battle of Eylau, and some of the events would have an aftermath that would continue to have an effect on many other events and situations. Following the events of the Battle of Eylau, the Battle of Heilsberg would occur sometime after. It would play its own part in the Napoleonic Wars. It would also follow other events like the Siege of Danzig, which had seen the involvement of Friedrich Adolf Graf von Kalkreuth, as well as the French represented by individuals like Lefebvre. Other events that had occurred in the past also included the Battle of Friedland, which would see the involvement of the French and the Russian empires in a conflict that would end in French triumph. The events would occur sometime in June and would see the involvement of several individuals, amongst them Michel Ney and Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, and on the Russian side, individuals like Bennigsen. The victory would eventually see the Russians retreat. Negotiations would occur after, and the treaties of Tilsit would result. Territorial changes would also occur in their aftermath. The soldiers' morale following some of the events above would factor into the course the Russians would decide to take. They would therefore look for a battleground for the upcoming conflict. Borodino would be an important village and site for the Battle of Borodino. The area chosen would have both limitations and advantages. Kutuzov would order for preparations to occur. The Battle of Shevardino would occur in the time before the Battle of Borodino and would see the Russian lines move from where they had been initially positioned to another location. There would be a justification behind this move, and it was not entirely random. Fighting would commence at some point in time in the Battle of Borodino and would be met by fierce conflicts. Events would see the Russian forces move back to the Kolorskoye cloister. They would change positions at other points in the fighting, and the conflict would see fierce and difficult fighting occur with several casualties on both sides. The French would be able to capture some positions. The battle would therefore end with the defeat of the Russian forces and a victory for the French. During the battle, Kutuzov would have some of his forces placed in strong positions. Napoleon would make some mistakes. Fierce fighting would occur, and several injuries would be incurred. Amongst the injured would be individuals the likes of Desaix, as well as a man called Compan. several positions would be gained by the French. In the aftermath of the fighting, the Russians would retreat and Moscow would be occupied by the French. But things wouldn't be as straightforward as that, as some of the decisions Napoleon would make in the aftermath of the Battle of Borodino would negatively impact his future. Battle of Leipzig, 1813. Fought over many days in October of 1813. The events would transpire at Leipzig, which was in the Kingdom of Saxony at the time. It would see the participation of several nations, amongst who were nations like Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Some of them had been involved in the other coalition wars that had preceded this one. The Battle of Leipzig would be a fateful event that would end in the victory of the coalition. It would change many things for Napoleon and for France. It would also see forces from several countries work together against a French army that had been reduced and was relatively weaker than at other points in time in the war. Some of the nations participating in the battle would include Russia, Austria, France, Saxony, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and many others. Numerous soldiers would be present. Some of them on the French side would be from the nations that France had conquered. Also present or involved in the conflicts would be persons like Karl von Schwarzenberg, Michel Ney, Edward Mortier, Napoleon, Joachim Murat, and Gebhard von Blücher. Numerous casualties would be sustained on both sides. And in the aftermath, France would be the destination for Napoleon. The following months would be eventful in the grand scheme of things. Prior to the events at Leipzig, the Battle of Borodino had taken place as a part of the French conflict with Russia. It ended in victory for the French and in massive territorial losses for Russia. But the battle would also be characterized by massive casualties. It would see several important and notable figures participating in it, the likes of Mikhail Kutuzov, Barclay de Tolly, and Michel Ney. Numerous troops would be involved in the fighting. Before the Battle of Borodino, the invasion of Russia had been underway for months. The Russian army had been using their own strategy in order to slow down the French advance. And the French forces had lost numerous troops to the conditions at hand and the shortages that existed. Moscow would be occupied, then set aflame, but things would go badly for France as they would find the conditions averse to them, the harsh winter dwindling their numbers as well as short supplies, illnesses, and attacks. The Battle of Vittoria would occur. In it, the coalition would be involved in a conflict that would see them emerge the successful party, and had seen the involvement of notable individuals on the French side, the likes of Joseph Bonaparte and several others. The outcomes of the Battle of Vittoria would add to the challenges that Napoleon was facing. The battle had taken place sometime in June of 1813, and many of its events would center around and occur in Vasconia, Spain. In the Battle of Leipzig, numerous forces would come together against France, and things would look worse and worse. The French people were also not at ease with events that had occurred, and conditions within France were not ideal. The army that Napoleon would gather would have its weaknesses, amongst which was youth and inexperience. But Napoleon would still create plans. Prior to the battle as well, a battle at Lutzen and another at Bautzen had taken place. Events would see a relatively short armistice take place, which would also see several individuals meet and discuss plans against the French and against Napoleon. A plan known as the Trachenberg Plan would come to form as a result of some of these discussions, and several armies would be formed. In command of some of these forces would be personalities like Gebhard von Blücher, who had been present in many of the previous battles. Crown Prince Charles John, Carl Philipp the Prince of Schwarzenberg, and Count Benigsen were also in charge of some of the other armies. The French would emerge triumphant from the Battle of Dresden, which had taken place in August and had seen people like Napoleon Bonaparte, Auguste de Marmont, Barclay de Tolly, and Tsar Alexander. It was a conflict that would involve numerous soldiers on both sides and result in several casualties. Other battles would also occur at various sites like Kulm and Dennowitz. They would meet with some triumph for the coalition. And some troops would change sides and loyalties, moving from the French side. This and many other factors would contribute to the situation that Napoleon would now find himself prior to the battle. The Battle of Graubünden would come about and would see defeat for the French. The fighting had transpired sometime in August and had seen the involvement of individuals like Jean Reynier and Nicolas Oudinot, as well as that of several soldiers in a conflict that would occur in Graubünden. Ney, von Below, and Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte would be involved in the conflicts at the Battle of Dennowitz, which would see the French emerge with a defeat, and this would have further harmful effects on the French. Forced into moving and then crossing the Elbe, Leipzig would become a region that many of the events that would occur would center around. Preparations would be made. The Allies' forces would be more than those on Napoleon's side. In the battle, many forces would be present, including some that were part of the Confederation of the Rhine. Some of the situation that had presented itself now had been due to the Allies and their following of the Trachenberg Plan. The army under Napoleon wasn't at its greatest strength. The numbers on the French side would be less than those opposing them, but Napoleon would still try to better his position, and some things would be in his favor. Michel Ney and Auguste de Marmont would be present at these battles, so too would be individuals like Marshal Pierre Augereau. On the coalition side, some prominent leaders would be present and would play an active role in the events of the battle. Several individuals would be involved in the planning, and the plan would involve primary and secondary attacks. But the plan would have its detractors, amongst whom was Alexander, who thought there would be limitations within it and saw aspects that Napoleon could use to his clear advantage. A new plan would be drafted. Some events that would occur in the course of the fighting would somewhat justify the ideas and opinions that he had made. Fighting would occur on the 16th of October, with additional forces expected to join both the French and the Allies' side. Several events would occur at Markkleeberg and at Dölitz. Some of the events that would occur at Markkleeberg would involve a bridge. At some point in time, Markkleeberg would be taken by Poniatowski, who had been involved in several other events over the course of the battle and fighting. Events at Wachau would see the involvement of the Russians, the French, and the Prussians, and would see clashes between the forces. Other areas that would be of interest would be Liebertwolkwitz, which would see Marshal MacDonald involved in the defense. It would also see the involvement of several persons and soldiers. Amongst some of them would be the likes of General Lauriston, in a location that would see some clashes. It would also see an Austrian attack, and saw some undertakings that would win acclaim by the general known as General Württemberg. General Drouot would act on behalf of Napoleon, and some of his actions would be successful. Over some of the course of the battles and fighting, some situations would develop that Napoleon could use. The fighting would last quite some time and would see several casualties. Lindenau would see the French involved in a fight for which their involvement would have some negative effects for another of the fights they'd be engaged in. The 17th would bring with it some events. Some reinforcements would be received as well, something that had been somewhat expected in the course of events. At some point in time, Napoleon would consider withdrawing, and would send one individual by the name of Mervelt with a letter to several of the Allies' leaders. Many factors had added to make his position a difficult one, and at this point in time he would send an offer to yield some locations to the Allies. An offer that would eventually find itself not being accepted in general by the Allied leaders who had received it. Napoleon in the general period had been making some considerations and had been thinking on his options. The Allies would attack, and many of the directions would have the Allies' forces. Several events would occur at Wachau, Dölitz, Probstheide, Ponsdorf, Schönefeld, and at other positions. Probstheide would see the Allies attack trying to gain positions, but they would meet resistance, and some of their attempts would be unsuccessful. Present in the fighting here would also be General Reyski, who had been active at the Battle of Borodino. Fighting would continue, and several individuals and events would be involved in it. At some point, Alexander would have requests made of him by Schwarzenberg after some of the events that had taken place over the course of the fighting here. At Lindenau, some Austrian troops would be pushed away by French forces, which had had an effect on some of the successes that the Allies had been able to achieve. Some discussions that had occurred at a conference had also seen some action agreed that would take place at Parthe River. However, at some point in battle, some troops would defect to the coalition, which would have some negative impact, causing the French to retreat from some areas. Many casualties would be endured in the conflict, and ammunition was increasingly running out. Given the current situation, several positions would be retreated from by the French. An evacuation would be undertaken, though, with attempts at not letting the coalition know that the retreat was occurring. The coalition would at some point in time find out about the French withdrawal and would then move to respond to it. Many casualties would be endured and many troops would be captured when an attempt to destroy a bridge the French were using, by the French themselves, would occur at the wrong time. Many casualties had been endured in the fighting of the battle. The defeat here would be damaging for Napoleon. It would add to the collection of defeats that he had had, and would somewhat be an early prototype of some of the other defeats that would befall him as the course of the wars went on, and more disadvantages accumulated on the French side. Battle of Waterloo, 1815. Scene in 1815. The Battle of Waterloo would be a famous battle that would end in defeat for Napoleon and would follow other battles like the Battle of Leipzig, which had been fought over many days in October of 1813. The events that would occur at Leipzig, which was in the Kingdom of Saxony at the time, would see the involvement of several nations, amongst who were nations like Austria, Russia, and Sweden. Some of them had been involved in the other coalition wars that had preceded this one. It would be a fateful event that would end in the victory of the coalition. It would also change many things for Napoleon and for France. It would see forces from several countries work together against a French army that had been reduced and was relatively weaker than at other points in time in the wars. Some of the nations involved in the battle would include Russia, Austria, France, Saxony, the United Kingdom and Sweden, as well as many others. Numerous soldiers would be present. Some of them on the French side would be from the nations that France had captured. Also present in the conflicts would be individuals like Karl von Schwarzenberg, Michel Ney, Edward Mortier, Napoleon, Joachim Murat, and Gebhard von Blücher. Numerous casualties would be sustained on both sides, and in the aftermath, France would be the destination for Napoleon. The following months after the Battle of Leipzig would be eventful. The Battle of Waterloo now would see several nations involved, including the United Kingdom, Prussia, France, and several others. It would also see the involvement of the Duke of Wellington, as well as individuals like Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher. It followed events like the exile of Napoleon and his return to France, as well as battles like the Battle of Ligny, which had seen the involvement of individuals like Gebhard von Blücher and Graf von Zieten in a battle that eventually ended in French victory. The Battle of Waterloo here would end in French defeat, which would have consequences for Napoleon. Its events would occur and center around Waterloo and would occur around June of 1815. This marks the end of the timeline for events in Napoleon's life for now, as well as the Revolutionary Wars. Several people would play a role in Napoleon's life, including his spouses Josephine de Beauharnais and Marie-Louise of Austria. Napoleon would drastically change policies within France. Areas he would come to change would include the legal system, the financial system, education, and the army. Some of the changes he would oversee saw differences in the way France was governed and those who had a role in governing it. Under it, some people would gain power and influence and other individuals would lose it or become less relevant. The Conseil d'État would be a part of the government that would come to have a role in several events. During his lifetime, the Napoleonic codes would also come into existence. They would have a wide influence, impacting several aspects of French life and changing the way things had been for several centuries before them. Many individuals would be impacted by their contents. They touched on several aspects, and many individuals would be involved in their creation, with several events taking place in their creation. Their influence would be seen in many other corners of the world as they shaped and impacted other nations and how they came to construct or build their own codes or constitutions. Other things that Napoleon would have a role in would include reforms within France that touched on many aspects of French life. Some of these aspects would include, but would not be limited to, issues to do with the economy and finances, whilst others were to do with education and how individuals would be educated within the nation. His influence as an individual would also see itself being expressed within the world of the military and military affairs, with some of the battles that he would be involved in being remembered to various extents for the ability that was exemplified over their course. That marks the end of the last episode into the history of Napoleon Bonaparte for now. If you enjoyed this series, please take the time to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos and to see other topics explored.